Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 391 through 393, which will cover manga chapters 497 through 499. Yes, we're on the doorstep of 500. But yeah, in these episodes, we are introduced to a whole host of new rivals to Luffy in the search for the One Piece, with the colorful cast of the supernovas dubbed the worst generation of pirates. Alright, so synopsis. The crew go on their own separate groups exploring the fun things that Sabori has to offer while searching for the craftsmen that can coat the Sunny for their trip to Fishman Island. But lurking in the dark shadows of the archipelago are the seedy underbelly of it all, with the entitled and corrupt celestial dragons, as well as the business of human trafficking and slavery. So there's a minor change after the moment where that pirate who is a slave gets his neck blown off. Hachi tells Luffy to get off the Bonchari bike, but before the Celestial Dragons appear in the anime, Luffy kind of asks why, and Hachi immediately yells back, "Just hurry and get off!" But in the manga, actually, Luffy complies immediately without question. I'm not sure why they added this change, because it really doesn't necessarily add, nor necessarily take away anything. It's just kind of a strange thing. It just also, I guess it does kind of take away the fact that, yeah, Luffy was still respectful of Hachi, and in the anime, it kind of reinforces Luffy's sort of naivety and kind of dumbness. But in the manga, Luffy actually does respectfully comply with Hachi and immediately gets off without question. So I kind of like this moment more in the manga because it does inform us a little bit more about Luffy and doesn't quite make him out to be like a stupid jerk. So another big change during that similar scene is in the manga, just before the Celestial Dragons arrive, there actually is a couple panels of a character that we have yet to meet, silhouetted with a huge axe, remarking on the pirate captain that was just executed. And from him, we learn that he was the captain of the Akumate pirates, and he was worth 60 million berries, and his name was Devil Diaz. And we don't get this scene in the anime, nor do we get any more background information on that pirate that was killed, other than the fact that he had a family that he wanted to get back to. This character will eventually show up very soon in the latter half of this arc. Another change that we see is in the anime, we get to see more of the fight against the random bounty hunters. But in the manga, the chapter actually begins just as Luffy's finishing up with his final Gomu Gomu no Bazooka on that last guy. So everything prior to that is actually filler, as well as the moment where they show the bounty hunters shift their target to Kami. That moment happens a little bit later in the chapter as opposed to happening directly after this moment. And then finally, the moment where Kami remembers longing to visit the amusement park is extended, and we get to see her as a child. But in the manga, we actually see a brief panel of Hachi instead reminiscing longingly to go to the amusement park, and we see a shot of the four silhouetted kids floating in the water looking up at the lights. These we can safely infer are actually Hachi along with his friends slash crew members Arlong, Kurobi, and Chu. And this might even be why Arlong named his small empire on Kokoyashi Village Arlong Park, because he kind of idolized and looked up to the amusement park, and it was a very special thing to a lot of fish people, as we'll go on to find out. But yeah, I'm not sure why they reversed this in the anime and emphasized Kami more so than Hachi. I probably would have liked both, to be honest. I think it's pretty, because having Kami's perspective expanded upon is important based on what happens later on. But I also think it is important to kind of look at it from Hachi's perspective as well. So I guess by reading and watching the anime, you kind of get the best of both worlds. But by only sticking to one of them, you kind of leave out the other perspective. So yeah, in this case, I think doing both would be actually very beneficial. Okay, so let's get into the episodes themselves. So these episodes starts off on a pretty funny note as we see that the crew has split up, with most of them going off with Hachi into the island to find the coding technician or the craftsman, while Usopp and Frankie stay behind to restock and reload the Sunny with what appears to be hundreds of cola bottles one by one, which seems inefficient and environmentally unfriendly. And yeah, I hope they plan on recycling those later, because there's like literally hundreds of bottles just piled up there. Sanji also stays behind to protect their treasure at the request, well, more like manipulation of Nami. But what always gets me is how Sanji just proudly says, "It's a me," kind of in this heavy Japanese accent, but it sounds more like Mario. I don't know. I always got a chuckle out of that. Then we get the obligatory and hilarious Zoro getting lost moment of each island as he decides to go for a stroll on his own. But by this point, the crew even knows Zoro so well that they've caught on to Zoro's lack of directional sense. They immediately call out to him. And for me, this whole conversation is so entertaining because Usopp and Sanji talk to him as if he was 5 years old. And even when Zoro shows he's at least thinking about how he won't get lost because each mangrove is numbered, just as he's about to leave, we see him mistakenly think they're docked at grove number 1 instead of grove number 41 because there was a bubble partially obscuring the number 4. But yeah, of course Zoro's going to get lost. Sliding over to the others, we get a bit of world building when it comes to Sabaody. Like with many of the other islands, we've seen its culture and infrastructure and economy is built very much around its unique identity. And for Sabaody, it's bubbles. And we see bubble-themed transportation as well as attractions. But despite how lively and bright this place seems on the outside, there is seemingly a deep-seated darkness hidden in it as we learn a bit more about the world nobles, who are properly referred to now as the Celestial Dragons. In Japanese, they're called the Tenyubito, which is probably more directly translated as like heavenly dragon people. Just, I don't think it really matters, but it's just kind of a side note that I wanted to share. One thing that I myself am still not quite clear on is why they're referred to as the Celestial Dragons, and more specifically the dragon part. I've never been able to understand what significance or relation to dragons the name has. So if anyone knows, let me know. And I've actually looked this up and to see if there's any sort of thing from Japanese culture or some other sort of story or even just wordplay, and I have yet to figure out where the dragon comes from. I don't know if Oda named them the Tenyubito or the Celestial Dragons because it sounded cool. I mean, I know dragons in Eastern culture are elevated to a very high sort of status, but yeah, beyond that, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe it has something to do with the will of D, because dragons and D start with the same letter, but I doubt that because it seems like too much of a coincidence. Another thing that we sort of get hints to is that racism that was heavily alluded to in Arlong Park, because it seems Hachi and Kami are very keen on being perceived as humans, so they go to great lengths to hide their fishman and mermaid parts. Even though I don't know how you look at Hachi and think he's human, but then again, we've seen so many messed up looking humans so far. I guess it's not that implausible. Of course, we'll get more into sort of the racism and the discrimination part of the fishmen or the fish people and the mer people. But yeah, just something to take note of here and now. The last thing to note is the particular attention paid to the bandages covering Hachi's sun tattoo that he's got on his forehead. At first, if you're a really eagle-eyed viewer and have amazing memory, you might think this might have to do with the fact that maybe people might see that and associate him with Arlong because most of his crew had this tattoo. But if you remember, the actual Arlong tattoo was different. It was basically his head, which we all remember from Nami's shoulder. And also, if it were that reason, I don't think Hachi would be so coy in trying to explain it. So it has to most likely be some other reason that we'll find out later. But I always love this layer of mystery that Oda inserts into beginnings of arcs. We do get to see the lighthearted fun and excitement of a new island, but we also get instantly hooked because of all these sort of subtle and not so subtle mysteries and points of intrigue that Oda introduces towards the beginning. Looping back around to that ominous warning Hachi gave the Straw Hats about the Celestial Dragons, we get to see the truly dark side of the world of One Piece as we see a man frantically causing a scene in the middle of town, pleading for someone to help him get a metal collar off of him. And this scene is truly spine-chilling as he's a pretty tough-looking pirate pleading for his life, saying he's given up on the New World again, setting up the New World as a sort of a terrifying place like the Grand Line was. In a lot of ways, Sabaody is very similar to Logtown, as it is sort of a way station before heading off into the next part of the ocean. Eventually, the collar starts to tick down and blowing this guy's head up, but surprisingly, he still lives for a little bit even after the explosion. But eventually, I think we're meant to think that he succumbs to his injuries and most likely dies eventually. What's crazy about this scene for me when I first read it and watched it was just how much fear it actually instilled in me. Like, of all the dangerous threats and enemies we've seen so far, this is the first time I felt some true uneasiness because pretty much, the way that it all this sets up, it kind of gives the audience a sense of powerlessness and futility. It's even further punctuated by the first appearance of the standard celestial dragon. I say standard because technically the Gorosei are celestial dragons, but they are far from normal or standard. The design and look of the celestial dragons say a lot about who they are as people, with their pure, clean white spacesuit-like appearance, with their bubble breathing apparatuses so as to not breathe the same air as the common folk. They actually do look otherworldly compared to your standard citizen in One Piece, almost like they hail from the future. It is interesting, like, the design choice between the rest of the One Piece world, where they almost look like they're from, not even from our modern time, but even further back, to what we typically consider pirate age, which is like, I don't know, like the 15th, 16th century. But then you have these celestial dragon beings who look like they're from the future. And so we basically passed the modern era and it skipped from the past to the future. And so it really does create a vast contrast between the celestial dragons, not just from the way they're treated by the other characters, but just in their own appearance and design. Even their choice in dogs indicates their sort of royal status and high, high society that they have, as we see that they have a pug walk up to the body of that pirate and pee on it. And pugs were said to have been bred in ancient China for the emperor and their ruling families. And in fact, the wrinkles of its forehead were bred to form the character or kanji for king or o. Also, a nice touch is that Oda modeled this pug after what it used to look like back in those days, as pugs, unlike what they look like today, were in fact a little taller and had a slightly longer snout, rather than being bred to have these squished faces and short legs that we see in modern day pugs. Now, I only know all this because I'm pretty obsessed with Instagram pugs, and so I just like pugs. I don't own a pug myself, but I like how derpy they look. But anyways, moving on. One last bit of interesting lore and history we get about the celestial dragons is that they are the descendants of the original 20 founding families of the world government 800 years ago. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, because that's pretty much what Professor Clover had mentioned back in Ohara in Robin's flashback. But now we get the added context of the celestial dragons. And again, it can be inferred that it is they who wiped out the Void Century. After a quick run-in with some bounty hunters, they find their way to the place where they can get the coding process done, but it turns out to be a bar called Shaki's Ripoff Bar. Gotta love the honesty in that one. Shaki seems to be very familiar with the Straw Hats, but the more Shaki talks, the more intriguing her character becomes. She's not only well informed about the pirates in general on the island, but also put together that Luffy and Garp are related. In addition, the fact that she used to be a pirate herself 40 years ago, which she's got to be hella old at this point, and she still looks amazing. And I love that bit where Luffy is shocked and asks how old she is, but then she just completely ignores him and glosses over that question and just continues on to the next subject. That was really smooth on her part. Unfortunately for them, though, Rayleigh, the coding craftsman, is away and they'll have to search for him. But Shaki drops a ton of bombshells of information on them, as well as us, as she warns them that there are currently 11 rookie pirates on the island with bounties over 100 million. It is here we're first introduced to the now famous Worst Generation group of pirates in the story of One Piece. These characters will all go on to play various larger roles throughout the rest of the story, even to this day in chapter 1085. It's here we get to meet some of the most influential and future fan favorite and fan hated characters in the series. Of course, you all don't know that yet, but I remember at the time when the worst generation of pirates were introduced, I didn't really know what to expect from them or how huge of a role they would play in the story. I figured they'd mostly be short term obstacles kind of contained to the next couple arcs, and maybe they might show up here and there, kind of like how Buggy and Alvida kind of just keep up reappearing. But yeah, I was not actually really sure what it was going to be like, and mostly that they're just going to be like kind of background rivals to Luffy. But I had not, in my wildest imagination, had any idea what Oda had planned for these characters. And yeah, it's pretty crazy. But I'll leave that. And that's the funny thing about the supernovas in the worst generation, though. It's pretty well known by this time that these characters were actually made up on the fly, as mentioned in the One Piece logbooks. I think the 27th one to be exact, which are these supplementary books that have some additional information on the series. And in it, he describes how the supernovas were imagined just one chapter prior to their debut because he thought that Sabaody wasn't exciting enough, which, given what happens, I mean, at least what I know, I have no idea how he came to this conclusion because even without the supernovas and the worst generation, Sabaody is plenty action packed. So I'm not sure how he came to this conclusion, but I'm sure glad he did. He also laments how he kind of regretted making so many of them, and because he's now had to figure out how to utilize all of them in the story at some point. But I have to say, in hindsight, and having read all the way up to at least chapter 1085, that he's pretty much succeeded. And I remember upon first viewing, I was particularly drawn to Law, Kid, and as well as Deus Drake. They all looked really cool just by the sheer, I guess, the concept of their design. I didn't know anything about their powers or what kind of personalities they would go on to have. But yeah, I think I do specifically remember being like, oh, Law, Kid, and Deus Drake look pretty cool. But anyways, to end episode 392, Shaki drops one last bombshell on us, proclaiming that Rayleigh is fine, wandering about the sort of the lawless area of Sabaody because she claims he's 100 times stronger than Luffy, as well as any of the other supernovas, which it doesn't sound like she's actually exaggerating, so it'll be interesting to see what this Rayleigh guy is. Shaki then tells them that even with all of these rookie pirates around, the Marines still shouldn't really be of a concern unless they actually cause some sort of a disturbance. Because right now, the Marines are all busy dealing with something bigger, and that something is most definitely the capture of Ace, and possibly having to deal with Whitebeard trying to rescue him. But yeah, with that, they go off to quote-unquote search for Rayleigh, but instead they end up going straight for the amusement park. But up till now, Pug has been very adamant about Kami not going to the amusement park and being very careful while they're in Sabaody, most likely because of the increased risk of being abducted and sold. Watching them enjoy the rides is pretty funny though, especially Brook remarking how each time he's on a ride, the slow ascent part of the ride is actually really nice before it inevitably drops at high speeds and he falls for it over and over. And here we get another bit of storytelling regarding the world from the mermaid and fishman view. Throughout the story, we've been getting small hints and allusions to how fish and mer people are treated in the surface world, and it is not a very safe place for them. We see that Kami and Hachi both have longed to go to this amusement park but have been unable to because of their species. And this story thread really starts to allude to the themes of racism and segregation, along with the aforementioned human trafficking and slavery. We start to get some of the some very real and dark areas of the One Piece world, albeit Oda does kind of gloss it over in sort of a veneer of fantasy by making the people that are being marginalized a fantasy species of the mer and fish people. But the message and themes are very real nonetheless, and I like that it's not afraid to tackle these subjects. Of course, this is just the beginning, as we will see in the rest of this arc, as well as the whole future, story dedicated to it, in addition to being a series running subject. But it is heartbreaking as well as heartwarming to see Kami brought to tears at just being able to experience a Ferris wheel ride. But sadly, this was and still is the reality for a lot of people in the real world when it comes to different opportunities. But yeah, as for Kami, unfortunately, this experience is about to get really bad for her as we see that she is being targeted for abduction and sale. Then we get to see the worst living beings in the entire One Piece series thus far. Yes, we've seen some evil and terrible villains, but nothing will ever compare to the disgust and hate we all collectively have as fans for this third celestial dragon that we're about to be introduced to. Now, we don't get to learn his name in these episodes, but I'm just going to tell you because you're going to find out the name literally in like another episode. But this is Saint Charlos. He is the most detestable being alive in the series. There is absolutely nothing redeemable about this character in any sense of the word. He is the literal definition of human trash and actually a good representation of the rich elite. Just in his initial introduction is enough for anyone to instantly hate this guy as he rides along the main stretch on the back of a slave that's clearly struggling. He's obviously spoiled and entitled to an extreme degree, even worse than when Helmeppo was first introduced. But I do not see Charlos being redeemed like Helmeppo was. You can also tell Charlos, like with many monarchs and royal families in history, there is a certain amount of like inbreeding happening to preserve their royal blood because just the way he talks and looks, you can definitely tell there's something off there. But yeah, he then threatens an EMT crew who are trying to save a patient because they dare to ignore his presence. He then kicks the patient, presumably dooming him, and then turns his attention to the nurse as he wants her for his next wife. And then guns down the nurse's fiance for protesting. And like seriously, it's one piece of shit move after another, and it's horrifying and like blood curdling at just how entitled and matter of factly he does all this. But just then, of course, the worst, or I guess you could consider it the best person you could ever want comes strolling down the street, and that is Zoro, not knowing a damn thing about anything, instantly crosses path with St. Charlos. Now, Charlos then, without warning, fires on Zoro for insolence, but of course, Zoro badassly dodges and almost instantly ends Charlos's life right then and there to everyone's shock and horror, particularly the other supernova pirates. However, before Zoro can land the slice, he's stopped by Jewelry Bonnie, who tackles him and pretends that he was her brother and that he was shot dead to prevent harm to a celestial dragon. She did this, obviously, in order to not have an Marine Admiral instantly dispatched to them, which would cause everybody trouble. And the interesting about this interaction is that Bonnie seems to have a devil fruit power that can alter her age, as we see her turn into sort of like a preteen or like a teenage child, then right back to her young adult self after the Celestial Dragons leave. This power we don't actually learn about immediately, nor do we even know the name of the fruit. And in fact, to this day, as of chapter 1085, we still don't know the name of this fruit. But I've always guessed that based on her ability to change her age, I think this fruit is going to be called the Toshi Toshi no Mi, Toshi being the Japanese word for age. But the other thing I noticed, or the other thing to notice here that really stood out to me is just how insanely fast Zoro is. He's already drawn his sword right up against Charlos. By the time Charlos basically fires off 1 to 2 shots. But what really sells this moment is when you look at that particular scene where Bonnie tackles Zoro, Charlos's eyes haven't even begun to move to the left, and he's still blankly staring ahead. Add to the fact that it also shows Bonnie's incredible instincts, speed, and reaction to be able to actually interrupt Zoro's attack, subtly indicating to us that yes, these worst generation supernova pirates are indeed pretty strong and capable, especially one of the weaker ones in that group still being able to react and to interrupt Zoro's attack. Then we get some more interesting tidbits of character building with the surrounding supernovas as we see each of them giving their take on Zoro's situation. Hawkins particularly always struck me as weird here, with his sort of weird predictive fortune teller like speak with his tarot cards. In addition to the contrast between Zoro and the others, as Zoro tries to help the fiance, everyone else is like, "Are you crazy?" It just kind of shows you that they're all on the same footing, but the rest of them are still pirates, and maybe not necessarily the nicest of guys. Also, before we move on, can we just appreciate the confidence level that Zoro has in himself, like in all aspects of himself? Like, Zoro is incredibly capable and competent, but when it comes to directions, Zoro is the absolute worst. And for him to be able to walk up to a celestial dragon, and the first thing he offers is to help with directions, completely unsolicited, is just downright hilarious. To cap off this set of episodes, we get to see a nice moment with Usopp, Sanji, and Frankie, the train trio, if you remember back from Water 7, sharing a fun conversation and just kind of relaxing. And there's really no particular reason other than it's nice seeing them back together sharing a fun moment. Just the three of them. That's really the only thing I wanted to mention about that. However, that moment will be cut short by the news from a panicked Chopper that Kami has been kidnapped, and Sanji, true to his character, again showing his calm and strategic thinking. Chopper, in his haste, wants to have everyone spread out and search the whole island. However, Sanji interrupts him and instantly tells them to stay put and wait for them, as he immediately knows what to do by reasoning that they need the help of experts, and says that he's going to call the Flying Fish Riders. And I'm always impressed with Sanji in sort of a crisis situation, how he's able to stay calm and rationally think about the smartest course of action. And he does it here again. It's like, it's so damn cool. However, this is really bad for Kami, as they need to find her quickly, because if she gets bought by a celestial dragon, everyone will be literally powerless to do anything. After what we just witnessed with the sheer amount of power the celestial dragons possess, to the point where a bunch of 100 million berry bounty pirates were quaking in their boots at the sight and thought of touching a celestial dragon. But yeah, the worst has happened. Kami has been kidnapped, and this event actually did have me worried, unlike a lot of situations in the past, because of just how seriously and darkly the celestial dragons are portrayed. They've been built up to this near untouchable status, and this threat of them taking Kami away is the worst case scenario that you already know is going to happen, but we will need to wait till the next podcast to discuss that. But anyways, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment, and if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram and Twitter account at SunnyGo Podcast for more updates. And as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. I'm just going to have like a really mini spoiler section. Just wanted to kind of touch upon two really small things. But if you're not interested in that, stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye. Alrighty, so spoiler section. This is going to be a very short one, but the two things I kind of wanted to mention was I was kind of surprised at how Bonnie's powers, how they will further be expanded upon throughout the series, but it is the slowest burn out of anything, I feel like, because we eventually learn that she can basically manipulate her age in any fashion. She can make herself younger, she can make herself older, but then it's revealed most recently on Egghead Island that she can actually affect the age of other people. So we saw her, obviously aging people down and up while they're on Egghead Island. But yeah, it's still interesting that we haven't actually learned the name of the fruit yet. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to mention was the cut scene with that silhouette with the man with the axe. And of course, we will go on to learn that is Sentomaru. And again, Sentomaru is another interesting character that comes back, obviously, in Egghead Island. But I always wondered why they removed this scene. Like, I guess it's not important that we learn more about the whatever his name was, Devil Diaz. But it was kind of interesting to see that Sentomaru was on the island, kind of already looking at everything. But yeah, I don't know why that scene was really cut other than for time. But anyways, that's pretty much everything I wanted to kind of talk about in the spoiler section. Not too much really here, but hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next episode. See ya.